Well, President Obama has been said fulfill his promise of extending a hand of friendship. The Cuban government is the real obstacle. The Cuban government will not open its clinch fist. Let me say that this is very significant. It's very significant for the government of Cuba, because the government of Cuba is in the midst of the most serious economic crisis ever in the history of Cuba. They had a liquidity crisis in which not American companies, foreign companies with business in Cuba could not have access to their own money in the Cuban bank. So at the time when this happened, then American dollars are going to start flowing. And it's also very significant because it's counterintuitive, but the more American dollars flow into the Cuban bank, into the bank of Raul and Fidel Castro, the less likely you're going to see any reforms in Cuba. This has happened before. Little reforms are abruptly brought to an end. They were when after the end of the Soviet Union, and there were some reforms that were ended when Mr. Chavez began to send money to Cuba, when tourists began to go to Cuba. So if you wanna encourage whoever inside the Cuban government to open up, even baby steps, then you should not be giving them money in exchange for nothing.
And finally, Daniel Griswold, what do you make of these initiatives by the Obama administration?
I think it's significant. The president's made clear he wants to loosen the embargo, and I think it's welcome. 50 years of basically the same policy has yielded very little fruit. The Cuban government hasn't changed its nature, its policies. Our embargo hasn't liberated one single Cuban, so I think this is a step in the right direction. I do think the president missed an opportunity. I mean, his first 2 years, he had a Democratic Congress. Republicans in Congress tend to vote 80 or 90% in favor of the embargo. Democrats, 75, 80% against the embargo. The president really had a chance when Democrats controlled Congress to fundamentally change the embargo. He had other items on his agenda, so now we're at the stage where it's just reforming it around the edges, and that's what the president's done. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think we should repeal the embargo and have the same kind of relations with Cuba as, say, we have with Vietnam.
Well, how about that, Frank Calzon? Why not have the same relations with Cuba that we have with Vietnam, a country we fought a war against?
Well, first of all, the two things. The policy of the United States toward Cuba is a hemispheric policy. It's a policy that promotes democracy and human rights throughout the Americas. So those who want to use the Vietnam or the China example are asking the United States to make an exception to the policy that promotes democracy in Argentina or in Chile or anywhere else. Secondly, it is not true that the policy has not changed. To say that the policy is the same policy that the U.S. put in place 50 years ago ignores the changes that Henry Kissinger made when he went to the OAS and said, now you could lift the hemispheric sanctions. It ignores the changes that Mr. Carter made when he opened up the intersections. It ignored the very good efforts of President Clinton. Whenever we had an administration willing to give something for nothing to the Cuban government, we had had a major crisis. You could look at Mr. Carter's, Mr. Clinton, those are two administrations, and I would bet that emboldening the regime will bring to an end the reforms and will create additional efforts to blackmail the United States from Havana.
If it's a hemispheric policy, the first 20 plus years after the Cuban Revolution, did we ever embargo Papadoc Duvalier? Did we ever embargo from the 30s to the 70s either Somoza, father or son? I mean, let's look at the hemisphere. We have some real winners running countries in the hemisphere.
Yeah, right, but didn't the U.S. government have something to do with the downfall of Duvalier? Didn't the U.S. government have something to do with promoting democracy in South Africa, for example? In the case of Burma, when the Americans went to see the leader of the opposition in Burma, and they said, We want to, what do you think, they asked her, about lifting the sanctions against the regime? She had an answer, which is my answer. In exchange for what?
Amaury Cruz?
Well, let's talk about promoting democracy in Cuba, specifically in American history, and begin with the Cuba-Spain-American War. What happened there? At the end of the Independence War, where the Cubans were about to win the war against Spain, the United States intervened and invaded Cuba as a consequence of yellow journalistic distortions of the reality that was taking place over there by the harsh newspapers and Mr. Pulitzer.
That's taking us back a little bit further.
Right, but I'm getting to the point
I was
that
just a young reporter then.
I'm getting to the point that throughout history we have had a situation where the situation in Cuba has been distorted. We don't get the facts. We get what we want to hear so that we can justify our interventions in Cuba. And those included not only the intervention during the Independence War, but 6 years later, when we were there for 3 more years occupying the country. Then in 1933, during the Machado dictatorship, we imposed a person who was called the Butcher by the people of Cuba, one of the worst dictators, most brutal dictators in the world. Then Batista, allied with Batista. And not only Cuba, if we go to the whole of Latin America, we overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. We overthrew democratically elected government in Chile. We were allied with the Argentinian juntas, with the Brazilian dictatorships. So we talk a good talk when it comes to democracy. But when it comes to real actions, what we do is defend corporate interests, the interest of Chiquita Banana and all others who have tried to exploit peoples throughout Latin America. And this is the perspective that people have in Latin America and in Cuba. So when they see or hear the United States telling us, oh, we're going to bring democracy to you, you need to do this, you need to have that, you need to have multi-party systems. People don't believe that. The people in Cuba have a different system, and this is what we don't understand in the United States. We have a view of things that is totally divorced from reality. And you need to go to Cuba. You need to see what it's like. If you go to Cuba, and you have been there, Ray, you see that the reality that has been painted to us as to what goes on over there, and particularly how people are supposed to be rebelling, are supposed to be disenfranchised and disaffected, is not the reality. We see it in the WikiLeaks cables, for example, where it has turned out in the WikiLeaks cables that the so-called Cuban opposition is fractured. They don't represent anybody. They have no influence. And most of them just want to get money to come for the United States.
Well, I don't. That's a lot in there, but
No,
Ray Walser, go ahead. I mean,
Well, first of all, we've just had the communist textbook interpretation of U.S. Latin American relations. It's very good. I'm surprised that our colleague here reflects what is clearly the official view of sort of the Cuban Communist Party. Anyway, there are obviously policies of the 1930s, policies of the Cold War era, post-Cold War policies, interventions. We intervened to get rid of, to help bring back Aristide. Aristide's coming back. So there's a very complex sort of history. What is the reality of Cuba today? I think that's the interesting, that's where we need to come back to. It's not the history. What is the reality? What is the quest for freedom of the people? The use of WikiLeaks. Yes, the opposition is divided. The opposition is uncertain because it lives in a repressed society. They're not allowed to communicate. They're not allowed to take leadership positions. I like it. It's Julius Swag, one of the person, talks about low-intensity repression. It's not the gulags of the 1930s, but it's still a Stalinist regime that is very good and very skilled in repressing, in dividing, in fracturing the sort of what would be a potential opposition. So that's where we are sort of today. Can a democratic movement prosper? I agree with the theory that change has to come within Cuba. I think we would agree on that particular point. But how are we going to get that political change that keeps track with the sort of, and my final point will be, Raul administers shock therapy, that old deadly neoliberal word, to the Cuban communist system. And yet he won't change, he won't shock the political system. by rocking the boat. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the upcoming Cuban Party Congress. And, you know, it's an interesting development at this point.